The oldest writing anyone has ever found in the Chinese language is, in part, a list of human beings to kill, not a poem or a prayer, a tally. It sits behind glass in a museum in Anyang, in central China, scratched into a 3,000-year-old slab of ox bone, and visitors lean in to admire how delicate the strokes are, because those strokes are the direct ancestor of the characters that more than 1 billion people still write today. Almost nobody reads what they actually say. What they say, over and over, is a number. How many captives to kill, often by beheading, and which dead king should receive them. Across the 2 centuries that bone was in use, more than 13,000 people were killed at that one site, on purpose, on schedule, as offerings to the dead. And that ledger of corpses is not the darkest thing on this list. It is only the first. Over the next half hour, we are going to count down 10 rituals from China's long history. Drowning, live burial, burning, self-inflicted blades, marrying the dead. Most of them got quietly sanded down into a footnote, if they survived into the popular story at all. But this isn't a parade of horrors for its own sake. Because standing right next to every one of these rituals is a second story that almost nobody tells. The Chinese officials, scholars, and ordinary people who looked at each one said no more and argued it out of existence, one ritual at a time. We start at the bottom, 3,000 years ago, with the bone behind the glass. To understand why any of this happened, you have to drop one modern assumption at the door. We tend to imagine the past as a place where people did terrible things because they didn't know better, as if cruelty were just ignorance waiting for progress to arrive. That is not what the record shows. The record shows something stranger and more uncomfortable. Most of these rituals were systems. They ran on a logic. They had administrators who kept the accounts, and they had defenders who could explain, in calm and reasonable language, exactly why a young woman had to go into the river. Start with the world that produced the oldest of them. Around 1250 BCE, the Shang dynasty ruled a stretch of the Yellow River Valley from a capital we now call Yinshu, the ruins of Yin, near modern Anyang. It was a society of bronze foundries, chariots, and walled compounds. What the inscriptions and the graves together suggest is a culture built on a single overwhelming idea, that the dead did not leave. Dead kings became powerful spirits. Above them sat a supreme power the Shang called Di, who could send rain or withhold it, grant a harvest or a victory, or take them away. The living were not separate from this crowd of ancestors. They were its servants, and servants feed their masters. That is the engine underneath this entire video. Not madness, a relationship. The dead were hungry. The gods were always watching. And the most precious thing you could lay on the table was a human life. The Shang capital was not a small place. Archaeologists believe several generations of kings lived at Yinshu for roughly 2 centuries, and in the soil beneath it they have found cemeteries, palace foundations, chariot pits, and something else. Hundreds of burial pits, each holding up to a dozen human skeletons, mixed with the bones of pigs, dogs, and even elephants. One estimate, drawn from the bones and the inscriptions together, puts the number of people sacrificed across those 200 years at more than 13,000. Not killed in war, sacrificed, killed as offerings, on purpose, as part of a working religious calendar. We know all of this because the Shang wrote it down, and because, unlike almost every other ancient power, they wrote it on something that survived. That is where our countdown starts. Number 10. Renji. Feeding the ancestors. The oracle bones are misnamed in English. We call them oracle bones, and picture fortune-telling, something quaint. What they actually record is a state religion that ran on blood. A diviner would take a turtle's underside or an ox's shoulder blade, carve a question into it, then press a heated point to the back until the bone cracked. The shape of the crack was read as the answer, and the questions were brutally practical. Whether the harvest would fail, whether to march on a neighboring people, and over, how many captives to offer, and to which ancestor, to keep the world running. One surviving inscription asks, baldly, whether human blood should be offered on a particular day. Another notes that people were sacrificed at a certain hour, and that 2 days later, it rained. The archaeologists eventually counted more than 2,000 sacrificial pits in and around the royal cemetery, some holding the headless, some holding only the heads. This sacrifice had a name, Renji, the offering of human beings to the spirits, distinct from burying them with the dead. It tended to spike in the worst moments, in drought, in famine, in war. when the gods seemed angriest, and the victims were usually not Shang. When researchers ran a chemical analysis on the bones from the sacrificial pits, the diet and chemistry of the victims didn't match the local population. These were outsiders, who appear to have been held at the capital for a few years before they were killed. That lines up with what the oracle bones themselves say, that many were war captives taken in raids. The people named most often as victims were a group from the northwest, the Shang called the Qiang. They were marched east, kept for a while, and then killed, often by decapitation, their bodies and heads sorted into pits, sometimes burned. The script that recorded all this killing is the direct ancestor of written Chinese. Those first writers used it for everything, for the weather, the harvest, a toothache, a royal birth. But running through the inscriptions, over and over, are the sacrifices. Who would be offered, to which ancestor, and how many? One of humanity's great inventions opens its record, in part, by counting the dead. But notice the date. This is the late Shang, and it is nearly the end of large-scale human sacrifice as a normal practice. When the Zhou dynasty overthrew the Shang around 1046 BCE, they brought a different theology, heaven, and a mandate that could be lost through misrule. By the archaeological and textual record alike, the appetite for mass sacrifice to the ancestors began to fade. The first great turn away from this ritual came not from us, looking back. It came from the people who lived right next to it. Feeding the ancestors was only one way the Shang tried to manage a world that kept turning against them. When the threat wasn't a hungry god but a cloudless sky, they reached for a different remedy, and a stranger one. Number 9. Fen Wu. Burning a person to make it rain. One more belongs to the Shang World, and it is the strangest of them all. When the rains failed, and on the Yellow River the rains failed often, the first response was a dance. Shamans, called Wu, would perform a rain ceremony, the Yu, calling on the spirits that governed water. In one account of how the dance worked, the shaman was made to move inside a ring of fire until the sweat poured off the body, the falling drops of perspiration standing in, by a kind of sympathetic magic, for the rain everyone was praying for. If the dance failed, the logic escalated. The reasoning, as far as scholars have been able to reconstruct it from the texts, ran like this. Drought was the work of a demon, and certain people, shamans, and the lame or badly emaciated, called Wang, were thought to be that demon's living incarnations. Expose them to the burning sun, the thinking went, and you expose the demon. Burn them, and you burn the drought itself. So they did, or at least they argued about doing it, in language explicit enough that we can read the intent. The oracle bones appear to record victims exposed to the sun or burned to bring rain, and we know it was still being proposed centuries later, because we have an argument about it preserved in writing. In the year 639 BCE, during a terrible drought, a duke of the state of Lu announced his intention to burn a shaman and a crippled man to end it. The episode is recorded in the Xunzang, one of the great early Chinese histories. And then something happens that you will see again and again on this list. An advisor talks him out of it. He argues, in effect, that burning a wasted, starving man cannot summon rain, that if heaven had wanted the man dead, it would never have made him, that the real answer to drought is to ration food and govern well, not to find someone to burn. The ritual is refused, in real time, by a person standing right there. The most famous version of this idea was even folded into legend about the Shang founder himself, King Tang, who is supposed to have offered his own body as a sacrifice to end a drought, and then substituted only his hair and his fingernails. A king quietly negotiating his way out of his own funeral pyre. That tension, the ritual demanded and the human being refusing it, runs under every story on this list. The next one turns it into a courtroom drama on a riverbank. Number 8. The River God's Bride. Around 400 BCE, in the Warring States period, an official named Ximen was sent to govern a poor, half-empty district called Ye on the Zhang River under Marquis Wen of Wei. He expected to find the land ruined by flooding. Instead, when he asked the locals what they feared most, they told him it wasn't the river. It was the wedding. Every year, the people of Ye were taxed heavily to pay for a bride for Hebo, the god of the river. A local shamaness, working with the district elders and officials, would go house to house. When she found a beautiful girl, she would announce that the girl had been chosen. The family had no say. The girl was bathed, dressed in fine new silk, and shut away for days in a specially built hut by the water, a fasting palace. where she was fed and adorned like a bride. Then, on the appointed day, she was laid on a decorated reed mat and pushed out onto the river. The mat drifted with the current for a stretch, and then it took on water, and then it sank. The cabal kept most of the tax money. Families with daughters had been fleeing the district for years. That was why the land was empty. Ximen Bao did not deliver a speech about reason. He did something colder and far more effective. He arrived at the next ceremony and asked to inspect the bride. Then he announced that this girl was not beautiful enough for a god, and that someone would have to go and tell Hebo the wedding would be postponed. He had his soldiers throw the shamaness into the river to deliver the message. She did not come back, so, with elaborate patience, he sent her disciples after her, then the elders. By the time he turned, thoughtfully, toward the local officials and suggested that perhaps they should go and check what was taking so long, the entire crowd had thrown itself on the ground, foreheads bleeding from kowtowing, swearing the marriages would stop. They did. Ximen Bao then put the district to work digging 12 canals, and turned the river that had been used as an excuse for murder into the thing that made the land rich again. A later verse held that ever since that magistrate threw the witches in the river, the ghosts and spirits had lost their power. One honest official, one cold afternoon, and a centuries-old ritual was simply over. But not every victim of these rituals was a stranger chosen by a shaman. Sometimes the people who died were the household itself, and they were expected to go willingly. Number 7. Xunzang, buried with the dead. There is a folk saying that captures this ritual with horrible economy. When the father dies, the sons follow him. When the husband dies, the wife and the concubines follow. When the master dies, the servants follow. And all of them are buried together. This is Renzong, also called Renshun, the burying of the living with the dead, so they can keep serving in the next world. It begins in the Qiang, and it does not really end for 3,000 years. In the tomb of Lady Fu Hao, a Shang queen, and, remarkably, a general who led armies under King Wu Ding, archaeologists found her treasures. Hundreds of bronzes, jades, thousands of cowrie shells. They also found 16 other human beings buried with her. They were not honored guests. They were grave goods, and it did not stay in the Shang. The most famous early case comes from 621 BCE, long after the dynasty fell, when Duke Mu of Qin, one of the great lords of his age, died, and 177 people went into the ground with him. 3 of them were senior, named ministers, Yanxi, Zhonghang, and Zhenhu, of the Ziche clan. One later account claims the duke had toasted these men at a banquet, said that since they had shared his joys in life, they should share his grief in death, and that the 3, drunk, agreed. Whether that is what truly happened is precisely the kind of thing historians still argue over, because the grief that survives sounds nothing like consent. We know it sounds like grief because the people of Qin wrote it down. They were horrified enough to compose a poem, and that poem survives. It is called Yellowbird, and it sits in the classic of poetry, the oldest anthology of Chinese verse. It mourns the 3 ministers by name and cries out that 100 ordinary men would gladly have been given to buy even one of them back. Read it now, and the most natural reading is plain. This is one of the earliest protest poems in the language, a ritual being condemned, in writing, by the very people made to watch it. And it raises a suspicion that runs under this entire entry, that much of the devotion later records describe may simply have been coercion given a prettier name. The other 174 who died with Duke Mu were never named at all, which could imply they were slaves or captives, counted the way grave goods are counted. What makes Xunzang uniquely disturbing is that, over time, it stopped being something done only to the powerful and became something demanded of the loyal. The records describe it as an act of devotion. Wives volunteered. Families that produced a willing victim could be publicly honored by the government, rewarded with titles and praise. How much of that devotion was real, and how much was pressure dressed in fine language, we mostly cannot recover, and that uncertainty is the point. A person could be praised into their own grave. It was fought, again and again. In 384 BCE, a later Qin ruler, Duke Qian, formally abolished the funeral sacrifice his own ancestors had practiced for centuries, a reform, one modern historian rated, in its moral weight, alongside the abolition of slavery. Han emperors discouraged it. The Book of Han records that one even stripped a prince of his noble title for asking permission to have a maidservant follow a relative into death. and still it kept returning, dynasty after dynasty, all the way down to the Qing, which tells you something uncomfortable about how hard a ritual is to kill once it has been wrapped in the language of loyalty. What replaced it, at least in part, was a strange kind of grace. Instead of burying real servants, families increasingly buried figurines. Clay and wooden replicas of guards, cooks, dancers, attendants, made as lifelike as possible so they could serve in the victim's place. The most famous example on Earth is built on exactly this logic, but that one is so vast and so dark that it deserves its own number, because the man who built it, by the account that survives, didn't trust the figurines to keep his secrets. Number 6. The First Emperor's Sealed Tomb. In 210 BCE, the man who had conquered all of China and named himself its first emperor, Qin Shi Huang, was buried beneath an artificial mountain near Mount Li. You know part of what guarded him. In 1974, farmers digging a well found the first of an underground army. Thousands of life-size terracotta soldiers, each with a different face, standing in formation in the dark. The terracotta army is the figurine logic from our last entry, scaled up to the size of a nation. An entire army of substitutes, so the dead emperor would never be without his legions. But the soldiers are the part we're allowed to see. The tomb chamber itself, the actual mountain, has never been opened. What we know about its inside comes from the historian Sima Qian, writing about a century later in the Shiji. His account reads like a nightmare. He says 700,000 conscripts labored on it across decades, that they dug down through 3 layers of groundwater and sealed the chamber with molten bronze, that the floor was shaped into a map of the empire, with the great rivers and the sea reproduced in flowing liquid mercury, kept moving by machinery, that the ceiling was studded with pearls and stones for the constellations, that lamps were filled with the oil of manfish, probably whale or seal fat, and lit so they might burn for a very long time, and that crossbows were rigged to fire automatically at anyone who broke in. For a long time, this was dismissed as fantasy. Then modern soil surveys found that the ground above the tomb carries mercury concentrations many times higher than the surrounding land, an anomaly that later studies have continued to confirm. The rivers of poison may well be real, but the darkest line in Sima Qian's account isn't the traps. It's a single, quiet sentence. After the burial was finished, someone pointed out that the craftsman who built the tomb knew all of its secrets, every passage, every trap, every treasure. So the new ruler, the dead emperor's son Huhai, gave the order. The inner gate was closed, and then the great outer gate was dropped, and the workers were sealed inside with the emperor they had served. Childless concubines, by the same account, were sent into the dark as well. If the record is right, the men who built the most elaborate tomb in human history became part of its contents. The figurine was supposed to be the merciful version of all this, the substitute that spared a real life. By this account, it spared no one. The substitutes stood in their pit, and the living were buried anyway. That gap between the ritual's mercy and its reality is exactly where the next 4 entries live. And the next one is the only ritual on this list where the victim picks up the knife themselves. Number 5. Gegu. Cutting your own flesh for a parent. Imagine your mother is dying. The medicine has failed, and you have been raised, your whole life, on the single highest virtue of your civilization, filial piety, total devotion to your parents. So you go quietly to the kitchen, and you cut a piece of flesh from your own thigh, and you cook it into a broth, and you feed it to her without telling her what it is. This is Gegu, cutting the thigh, and it was held up not as mutilation, but as the supreme act of love. It sounds like a one-off act of desperation. It was a recognized tradition that lasted more than 1,000 years. The dynastic histories first recorded in the Tang period. Cases multiply through the Song and Yuan, and it became most widespread in the Ming and Qing dynasties. There was even a variant, Gegen, that involved cutting into one's own liver. Scholars think the practice flowed in along the Silk Road, carried by Buddhist stories that praised giving up the body for others, then fused with Confucian filial duty until the two were impossible to separate. What made it spread was the reward. The state honored it. A daughter or daughter-in-law who sliced her own flesh for an elder could be given official titles. Her family granted tax breaks, and in some cases, she could marry into a higher social class because of it. So the practice did exactly what incentives do. By the evidence of the dynastic histories, those who performed it in the earlier centuries were mostly men. From the Song onward, as marriage customs bound women ever tighter to their husbands' families, it became overwhelmingly women, cutting themselves for parents-in-law. In one recorded Tang case, the throne rewarded a man who had carved flesh from his own body for a sick parent with an official post, and yet the orthodox teaching said the opposite. The most basic principle of filial piety held that your body, every hair and inch of skin, was a gift from your parents that you had no right to damage. By that logic, slicing yourself open was not devotion at all, but a violation of it. More than one scholar and emperor said so, and the practice was outlawed more than once. It survived anyway, which suggests that what people were reaching for was less a rule than a feeling, a way to prove a love too large for ordinary acts. There is a quiet tragedy buried in the ritual. There was almost no chance the flesh actually healed anyone. People did it anyway, for two reasons the records spell out: a faint hope it might work, and a deeper belief that an act of devotion this extreme might move heaven itself to grant the wish. It was less medicine than prayer written in blood. The practice faded only with modern medicine, and largely disappeared after 1949. But if you could give your body for a living parent, what did you owe a dead spouse? In some parts of China, the answer was a wedding. Number 4. Minghun, marrying the dead. If a person died unmarried, an old fear said their spirit would be lonely, and a lonely spirit is a dangerous one, liable to come back and trouble the living family. The solution was Minghun, a ghost marriage. You found a spouse for the dead. Often, both partners were already dead. A family with a deceased unmarried son would hire a kind of matchmaker to find a deceased unmarried daughter from another family. There would be a bride price, a dowry, a ceremony, sometimes with the actual remains exhumed and reburied together so the couple could share a grave for eternity. The roots run deep, though exactly how deep is disputed. Some scholars trace the custom to the Han Dynasty. Others push it back as far as the Shang. What the records agree on is that it had become widespread by the Tang. One 19th-century sinologist offered a theory that, if it holds, ties this ritual to the very first one on our list. That ghost marriage began as a gentler replacement for an older practice of killing a man's living wife so she could join him in death. The same instinct we saw turn real servants into clay figurines, now turning a human sacrifice into a wedding. There was a colder, more practical pressure too. Custom often held that a younger child should not marry while an elder remained unwed, so if the eldest son had died single, a ghost bride could, in effect, clear the way for his siblings to marry at all. One of the earliest stories attached to it is genuinely moving before it turns strange. Cao Chong, the brilliant young son of the warlord Cao Cao, died in 208 CE, at just 13. His grieving father found him a bride, a deceased daughter of the Zhen clan, and had the two buried together, so that two people who had never met in life might keep each other company in death. And here is what keeps this ritual from staying safely in the past. It never fully stopped. Ghost marriage has been illegal in China for over 70 years. It persists anyway, in pockets of the rural north. And the persistence has a horrifying modern edge. Because a ghost groom needs a corpse for a bride, a black market in stolen female bodies has grown up around the custom, with bodies dug up and sold. In one documented case, a stolen corpse changed hands for tens of thousands of yuan. A ritual that began as comfort for the grieving became, in the worst cases, a motive for grave robbing. The dead, it turns out, are not the only ones who can be exploited by a wedding. So can the very much alive. Which brings us to the women of the Ming court. Number 3. The white silk. Ming concubine sacrifice. When the founder of the Ming dynasty, the Hongwu emperor, died in 1398, around 40 of his concubines were required to die with him. This was Xunzang again, the buried with the dead ritual from earlier in our countdown, but resurrected at the very top of one of China's most sophisticated empires, 1,500 years after the Shang. The Ming had taken it back from the Mongol Yuan dynasty they had overthrown, a people for whom companion death was an old steppe custom. By Marco Polo's account, the escort carrying a dead Mongol Khan to his resting place killed those they met on the road, so that the slain might serve their lord beyond the grave. The method was a length of white silk. On the day of the funeral, the chosen women were brought to a hall, given a final meal, and then made to step onto stools beneath nooses of silk hung from the beams. The stools were taken away. Some sources describe throats cut instead. Some describe women buried alive. Across the first 5 Ming emperors, roughly 100 imperial women died this way. We even know some of their names, because the Ming court took foreign tribute. The Korean kingdom of Joseon sent young women as gifts to the Ming emperors. One of them, remembered as a Lady Han, was among those condemned to die at the funeral of the Yongle emperor in 1424. And the Korean court records preserve a detail that is hard to read unmoved. A condemned consort knelt before the new emperor and begged to be allowed to go home, just to care for her elderly mother. She was refused and hanged with the others. A woman asking to go look after her aging parent, the very filial devotion this whole culture exalted, and the answer was the silk. Watch the pattern hold one more time. This ritual did not fade slowly. It was abolished, deliberately, by a single man. The Ming emperor who reigned twice. First as the Zhengtong, then, after his capture by the Mongols and a coup that put him back on the throne, as the Tianshun emperor, ordered on his deathbed in 1464 that the practice of burying his women with him must end. And it did. The most powerful institution in the empire stopped, because one emperor decided the ritual was monstrous, which leaves two entries. The next is the only one where the victim and the saint are the same person, and they're trying to never die at all. Number 2. Becoming a living Buddha. Some rituals on this list were done to people. This one, certain monks did to themselves, over a period of years, with total deliberation, and they believed it was the opposite of death. The goal was to become what tradition called a living Buddha, to die in so perfect a state of meditation that the body itself would not decay. A monk who managed it was understood not to be fully dead at all, but suspended between life and death, his incorrupt body taken as proof of his attainment and venerated as a relic. What the surviving bodies and the later records let us reconstruct is a slow, controlled self-destruction. A monk would spend years on a punishing diet of nuts, bark, roots, and pine needles, starving away every scrap of fat and muscle, the soft tissue that rots first after death. Then, in the most detailed accounts of the practice, better documented in the related tradition as it later developed in Japan than in its Chinese origins, he would drink a tea brewed from the sap of the lacquer tree, a substance toxic enough to turn his own body poisonous to the insects that would otherwise consume it. Finally, he would seal himself into a chamber or a coffin and meditate and chant until he stopped. This was practiced in China within the Qian tradition, the school the West knows by its Japanese name, Zen, and related ideas traveled from Tang China onward across East Asia. The most revered example is also the earliest that survives. Anyang, the sixth patriarch of Qian, who died in 713. After his death, his body was preserved, then coated in lacquer, and it is still there today, seated cross-legged in a hall at Nanhua Temple near Shaoguan in Guangdong, where a Jesuit traveler recorded seeing it in the late 16th century. We should be honest about the odds, though. For every monk whose body held, many more simply rotted and were quietly buried. Success was rare, and never something a monk could count on. And the modern epilogue is extraordinary, where it is a lacquered Buddha statue from China that was loaned to a museum in the Netherlands and run through a CT scanner. Inside it, perfectly preserved in the lotus position, was a real monk, identified from an inscription as a master named Liuchuan in the Qian tradition, who is thought to have died and self-mummified around the year 1100, and who was later sealed inside the figure. The scan revealed that his internal organs had been removed and replaced with rolled-up scraps of paper covered in Chinese characters, most likely prayer or scripture, sealed inside a man, sealed inside a god. The horror here is not violence, it is willpower. A human being calmly, patiently, over years, turning their own body into a relic. It is the most peaceful image on this list, and, in its way, one of the most unsettling, which makes the contrast with our final entry total, because number 1 was the loudest, most public, most deliberately terrifying ritual the Chinese state ever staged, and it is the one the rest of the world got most wrong. Number 1. Lingchi, the lingering death. You have heard its Western name, death by 1,000 cuts. It is Lingchi, and almost everything the phrase conjures in your head is wrong. Lingchi was a method of execution used in China from roughly the year 900 until 1905. Its penal form was codified under the Liao dynasty and reserved for what the law considered the very worst crimes: treason, killing your own parents, murdering your master. The condemned was bound to a frame in public, and the executioner removed the body in pieces over an extended time. The point was never speed. But the popular image, a victim conscious through 1,000 or even 10,000 slow cuts, is largely a myth, and historians have traced exactly how that myth was made. In reality, the cutting was often mostly done after death. The first cuts tended to be large, the blood loss rapid, and the victim frequently dispatched early, by a cut to the throat or the heart, or sedated with opium first, sometimes as an act of mercy a family could even pay for. One Australian traveler who claimed to have witnessed it complained, back in 1895, that the punishment's cruelty had been wildly misrepresented in the West. So what was the ritual actually for, if not maximum pain? This is the part that ties our whole countdown together. In the Chinese worldview that runs through every entry on this list, your body was a gift from your parents, and to die whole was to enter the afterlife whole. Lingchi destroyed that. Historians who have studied it closely argue that its real horror lay there, in the loss of bodily integrity, the posthumous shame of being scattered into parts, a body that could never enter the next world whole. It was a punishment aimed at the soul, and the ending of it is the perfect close to this story. Lingchi was abolished on the 24th of April, 1905, as part of a sweeping reform of Chinese law led by a reformist official named Shen Jiaben. But Shen did not invent the argument. He won it by reaching back 7 centuries and quoting a Song dynasty scholar, Liu You, who had written, around the year 1200, that a punishment which keeps a man seeing and hearing while his flesh is stripped away injures the harmony of nature and shames a wise generation. One scholar's protest, written and copied and passed down by jurists for 700 years, until it finally became law. The very last entry on our list of unspeakable rituals was ended by the oldest Chinese tradition of all, the tradition of someone writing down that this is wrong. Go back to that museum in Anyang, and the oracle bone behind the glass. We started there because it looked like the beginning of 3,000 years of darkness, a writing system born as a ledger for the dead. But look again at what we actually found. At every single station on this list, standing right next to the ritual, there was a person refusing it. The advisor who talked the duke out of the burning, Ximen Bao at the riverbank, the emperor who outlawed the white silk from his deathbed, Liu You, with his brush, and Shen Jiaben 7 centuries later, finishing the sentence Liu You started. The same hands that carved the first tally of the sacrificed also carved the first arguments against sacrifice. The history of these rituals is not a story of a cruel people slowly civilized from outside. It is the story of a civilization arguing with itself, in writing, for 3,000 years, and, line by line, winning. Which is why the question I want to leave you with isn't how could they? It's this. Every one of these rituals had its defenders, calm, reasonable, certain people who could explain exactly why it had to continue. And every one was ended by someone willing to stand up in the middle of the ceremony and say it was wrong, usually at real risk to themselves. So, which one of these rituals do you think was the hardest to argue down? And would you have been the person on the riverbank or the one in the crowd? Tell me where you'd have stood. I read the comments. If you want to keep walking through the parts of Chinese history the textbooks tend to hurry past, the channel is right here waiting for you.